The unthinkable is no longer just a tabletop exercise inside the Pentagon. It is now an active, high-alert scenario unfolding in real time across the eastern Mediterranean. The president of Turkey has just issued a direct, unequivocal threat of military intervention against the state of Israel. Listen very carefully to the geopolitical gravity of this moment. We are looking at the second largest standing army in the NATO alliance, deliberately positioning its military apparatus to clash with America's most heavily armed and technologically advanced ally in the Middle East. This is not about diplomatic posturing or mere political rhetoric. This is a cold, calculated strike at the very foundation of the Western security architecture. If Ankara greenlights its expeditionary forces or weaponizes its geographical choke points against Tel Aviv, the Allied axis fractures overnight. The board is set, the red lines are blurring, and the calculus of global power is about to be completely rewritten. Welcome back to the briefing room. In this theater, we strip away the emotional noise and the political optics. We operate strictly through the lens of realpolitik. We analyze the raw data, the kinetic leverage, and the brutal shifts in national interests that dictate global survival. You are here because you understand that the world is not governed by goodwill, but by force, logistics, and calculated deterrence. Today's dossier deconstructs the escalating friction between Ankara and Tel Aviv, exposing the military realities and the geopolitical shockwaves threatening to tear apart the Middle Eastern chessboard. Let us break down the kinetic reality of a direct military confrontation. If Ankara's threats materialize into physical force projection, we are looking at an unprecedented clash of military doctrines. On one side, overwhelming mass and drone warfare. On the other, stealth and an impenetrable high-tech fortress. According to open-source military assessments, the Turkish armed forces boast a standing military of over 500,000 personnel. This is the second largest fighting force in the NATO alliance. But a conflict in the eastern Mediterranean will not be fought with infantry battalions. It will be a naval and aerospace engagement. And Turkey has meticulously retooled its military-industrial complex for exactly this type of theater. At the tip of Ankara's spear is the TCG Anadolu. This is not just an amphibious assault ship. It is a dedicated drone carrier, capable of launching swarms of battle-tested unmanned aerial vehicles directly into the operational zone. We are talking about the Bayraktar TB2 and the heavily armed Akinci drones. These platforms are not theoretical. They have been combat-proven in Libya, Syria, and Nagorno-Karabakh, demonstrating a terrifying capacity to systematically dismantle mechanized units and air defense radars. Backing up this drone armada is a massive fleet of modernized F-16 Block 50-plus fighter jets. Turkey possesses the numerical advantage, the logistical depth, and a proven willingness to sustain expeditionary operations beyond its borders. But projecting power against Israel is a fundamentally different equation. Israel is not a regional proxy militia. It is a hyper-advanced technological powerhouse. If Turkish aerial assets breach the eastern Mediterranean, they will run headfirst into the most sophisticated, multi-layered air and missile defense grid on the planet. Tel Aviv's shield is designed to be impenetrable to conventional mass. You have the Iron Dome for low-altitude interception, David's Sling for mid-range ballistic threats, and the Arrow 3 system designed for exoatmospheric neutralization. A Turkish drone swarm would face devastating attrition rates before ever acquiring a primary target. Furthermore, the Israeli Air Force commands absolute technological supremacy. The F-35I Adir stealth fighters give Tel Aviv the ability to penetrate contested airspace, establish instant air dominance, and deliver lethal blows to Turkish naval assets and staging grounds before those assets even know they are being painted by radar. Israel does not need to match Turkey's soldier for soldier. Their doctrine relies on precision, technological overmatch, and overwhelming electronic warfare. Let us talk about that electronic domain. Israel's cyber warfare capabilities are unparalleled. In a kinetic exchange, the first strike would likely not be a missile, but a massive cyber offensive targeting Turkish command and control networks, blinding their radar systems, and severing communication with their expeditionary forces. The goal would be to neutralize Ankara's offensive capabilities capabilities before a single piece of hardware crosses into Israeli airspace. The logistical realities of this theater dictate a brutal maritime choke point. To strike Israel, Turkey must project naval power through the heavily monitored waters of the eastern Mediterranean. This exposes their surface fleet to Israeli submarines and coastal defense cruise missiles. The mathematics of this clash are highly lethal. Any localized skirmish would result in severe material degradation and critical personnel losses for the aggressor attempting to cross the water. We must also factor in the ultimate unspoken variable in this equation, the strategic deterrence. While never officially acknowledged, open-source intelligence universally operates on the assumption that Israel possesses a formidable, non-conventional deterrent capability. This absolute fail-safe fundamentally alters Ankara's risk calculus. A conventional probing attack is one thing. Pushing the Israeli state to a point of existential threat triggers an entirely different set of apocalyptic protocols. Therefore, any Turkish military action would have to be highly calibrated. It would have to be a surgical strike designed to project dominance and inflict political pain without triggering a catastrophic retaliation. This is the geopolitical horror of the situation. We have two highly capable, heavily armed regional heavyweights. Turkey has the mass, the tactical drone integration, and the strategic depth. Israel has the stealth, the cyber dominance, and the ultimate defensive shield. A direct clash would not be a swift victory for either side. It would be an intense, high-attrition meat grinder, inflicting critical structural damage on both militaries. But the kinetic hardware is only half the battle. The kinetic hardware is only half the battle. The true catastrophe is unfolding on the macro chessboard. This is a geopolitical nightmare for Washington. The Allied axis is actively tearing itself apart. The United States relies on a carefully balanced web of alliances to project power across the globe. Now, Washington is watching its second largest NATO ally threaten to neutralize its most critical Middle Eastern partner. The leverage is shifting, and the United States is caught in a strategic quagmire. Let us address the elephant in the room, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, specifically Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. There is a critical, highly classified legal reality that dictates this entire standoff. Article 5 is strictly a defensive mechanism. If Turkey initiates a preemptive strike or deploys expeditionary forces against Israel and Tel Aviv retaliates with overwhelming force, the NATO Mutual Defense Pact is null and void. The United States and the rest of the alliance have zero legal obligation to defend Ankara if Ankara throws the first punch. But legality is just paper. The optical reality is devastating. If Israeli fighter jets are striking Turkish naval assets or staging grounds, the psychological blow to NATO unity would be irreversible. The alliance would be paralyzed by internal division. European capitals would panic. The command structure would fracture. Ankara knows this. The Turkish leadership is playing a high-stakes game of regional hegemony, and they are holding one of the most powerful bargaining chips on the planet. The Incirlik Air Base. Located in southern Turkey, Incirlik is a vital staging ground for United States military operations across the Middle East and Eurasia. But more importantly, open-source intelligence universally acknowledges that Incirlik houses a stockpile of United States B-61 tactical nuclear gravity bombs. Let that sink in. Ankara effectively controls the host territory of a forward-deployed American nuclear deterrent. If Washington attempts to forcefully intervene or heavily supplies Israel to counter a Turkish advance, Ankara can immediately restrict airspace. They can ground American flights. They can weaponize American access to its own strategic assets. It is a geopolitical hostage situation. Turkey is daring the United States to cross its red line, knowing full well that the Pentagon cannot afford to lose that base. The strategic trap tightens even further when you look east. Washington cannot afford to lose Turkey. Turkey is the geographic gatekeeper of the Black Sea. They control the Bosphorus Strait. They are the essential geographic bridge between Europe and Asia. If the United States alienates Ankara to protect Tel Aviv, they risk pushing the Turkish state completely out of the Western orbit. A marginalized Turkey would fall directly into the waiting arms of the Russian Federation and the Chinese Communist Party. Moscow and Beijing are watching this friction with intense calculation. A fractured NATO, a distracted America, and a rogue Turkey align perfectly with their global objectives to dismantle American unipolarity. This brings us to the core concept, the regional hegemony gamble. The Turkish administration is not making making these threats based on pure ideology or regional solidarity. This is a calculated, realpolitik maneuver to assert absolute dominance over the broader Middle Eastern theater. By openly challenging Israel, and by extension the United States, Turkey is signaling to the region that the old security architecture is dead. They are proving that the United States is overextended. They are highlighting that Washington is paralyzed by internal political division and incapable of managing its own alliance network. Ankara wants to establish a new paradigm where no major geopolitical decision in the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean happens without Turkish approval. They are pushing the boundaries, testing the deterrence threshold of the West, and actively exposing the rifts within the Allied axis. If Washington applies pressure on Israel to de-escalate, Turkey wins the diplomatic narrative and establishes itself as the ultimate regional power broker. If Washington backs Israel completely, Turkey leverages Incirlik, fractures NATO cohesion, and pivots east. It is a brilliantly ruthless strategy. The fallout is catastrophic either way. The United States is being forced to choose between the integrity of its European security umbrella and the survival of its primary Middle Eastern forward operating base. This is the brutal reality of the great game. Alliances are temporary, national interests are permanent, and right now, Turkish national interests dictate the systematic dismantling of American leverage in the region. We have analyzed the kinetic military clash. But the most devastating weapon in Ankara's arsenal is not a drone swarm or a naval task force. It is geography, and it is economics. We are now entering the realm of silent, non-kinetic warfare. This is where Turkey can inflict catastrophic structural damage on the Israeli state without firing a single shot. Let us talk about the lifeblood of any modern military: oil. Israel's highly mechanized armed forces, its aerospace superiority, and its constant defensive patrols consume massive quantities of energy. According to international energy monitors, Israel imports roughly 40% of its annual crude oil consumption from a single critical source: Azerbaijan. But that Azerbaijani crude does not magically teleport to Tel Aviv. It is pumped through a massive transit network, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which terminates directly at the Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. And Ceyhan is located on the southern coast of Turkey. Ankara holds the valve. This is the ultimate geopolitical choke point. If the Turkish president wants to paralyze the Israeli war machine, he does not need to send F-16s into contested airspace. He simply gives the order to shut down the Ceyhan loading terminals. The flow of crude stops immediately. Israeli oil tankers are barred from docking. In an instant, nearly half of Israel's energy supply is neutralized. You cannot maneuver mechanized tank battalions, launch fighter jets, or power the massive radar arrays required for the Iron Dome on solar power. They run on heavy fuels. A sudden 40% deficit in crude oil would trigger an immediate energy crisis inside Israel. Strategic reserves would be drained at an alarming rate. The logistical strain would be immense. Tel Aviv would be forced into panic buying on the open market, securing alternative energy shipments from the Americas or West Africa. This heavily increases transit times, maritime insurance premiums, and exposes those supply lines to other hostile actors. The financial bleeding would be severe, but the economic strangulation does not stop at energy. Ankara has actively initiated the weaponization of bilateral commerce. Open source financial data indicates that before this escalation, the trade volume between Turkey and Israel hovered around $7 billion annually. Turkey has moved to unilaterally suspend this commerce. You have to look at the specific data matrix of that trade to understand the gravity of the blow. Turkey is not exporting luxury goods to Israel. They are exporting the foundational building blocks of an industrial state: steel, cement, heavy construction materials, automotive components, plastics, and raw industrial chemicals. These are the exact materials required to maintain infrastructure, rebuild civilian centers after kinetic strikes, and keep a wartime manufacturing economy functioning. By severing this $7 billion supply chain, Turkey is orchestrating a methodical asphyxiation of the Israeli domestic market. Construction projects halt. Industrial manufacturing stalls. Supply chain bottlenecks cause immediate and aggressive inflationary spikes. The Israeli economy, already under immense structural pressure from mobilized reserve forces and sustained multi-front conflict, is suddenly starved of its primary cost-effective industrial supplier across the Mediterranean. This is a masterstroke of the regional hegemony gamble. Turkey is accomplishing what rival regional powers have historically failed to do. They are exerting tangible, crippling leverage over Israel without triggering a conventional war that would draw in American carrier strike groups. They are proving to the broader Middle East that Turkey is the only power capable of bringing the Israeli economy to the brink through sheer geographic positioning. This elevates Ankara's prestige, it diplomatically isolates Israel, and it traps the United States in an unwinnable scenario. How does Washington counter a sovereign nation deciding to close its own commercial ports? You cannot deploy an aircraft carrier to force a pipeline valve open. There is no military solution to an economic and logistical blockade of this nature. The United States would be forced to financially underwrite Israel's resulting economic losses, pouring billions of taxpayer dollars into an artificial life support system just to keep the Israeli economy from collapsing under Turkish pressure. This drains American resources, it fuels domestic political friction inside the United States, and it perfectly achieves Ankara's primary objective, bleeding the Allied axis dry and proving that American unipolarity and its ability to protect its allies is fundamentally broken. The board is being tilted, the leverage is entirely in Ankara's hands, and they are squeezing the economic arteries with ruthless precision.